So last time we said that we would talk a little bit today about this idea of the antidotes to afflictive emotions that we started touching on last time, and then use the rest of the time to start talking about the 12 links of dependent arising. So we'll start like we say, we'll start with a little bit about those antidotes. And so last time we touched on that, but I'll just explain a little more, right? So we were talking about how these, I'm calling it afflictive emotions, right? These, or like afflicted states of mind, right, are the cause of samsara, right? Which means the cause of suffering. And so, and we also said how even the Buddha's description of the Four Noble Truths is almost like a diagnosis and then a treatment plan, right? That if you look at their suffering, right, which is in this case it's not just a physical disease, it's the whole disease of samsara, right? Of every kind of suffering, which include physical diseases, but also all kinds of mental suffering. Right? Then there's a cause, right? So the cause is those afflictive emotions. Then they can cease, right? There's the truth of cessation, and then the path, right? So the path has to include then how do you counteract those afflictive emotions. So in one sense, actually, they say that sometimes they say that there are 84,000 different methods in Buddhism. So it's reasonable to say actually that all 84,000 of those are just different methods to decrease afflictive emotions or overcome them. So in that sense, what are the antidotes for actually in that sense, everything that all Buddhist teachings in a way are designed. If one knows how to practice them, then they're designed to counteract afflictive emotions. That's the whole point, right? So whether one is to counteract ignorance or anger or craving or jealousy or spite or envy or all those different states, that all the different teachings are to counteract those. And I'll say this too, His Holiness the Dalai Lama often points out that if you're, if you say you're practicing Buddhism, but then your afflictive emotions aren't decreasing, right? If you're not having less anger or less confusion or less aggression or less less jealousy and so on, then the practice isn't really working. Right? That's the sign of progress. And Ken Rinpoche said that too. He sometimes when I don't know if you've been here. Sometimes when he's taught on retreats, and he'll go through all these different rituals that you do at the beginning of a retreat or something like that, and then the method of doing the retreat. And then he'll say, he's often said that. He said sometimes people have the wrong idea when they do especially sometimes there are retreats where you recite mantras and visualize, and he'll say sometimes people have totally wrong view that having some kind of vision or is a sign of success, or having really good dreams is a sign of success, or having some kind of clairvoyance, something like that. But and then he says the sign of success is are your afflictive emotions decreased. Right? If you have more pride at the end of a retreat, or more anger, or more craving, then the retreat was not a retreat, right? Because actually the definition of retreat means getting away from your own afflictive emotions. So it's creating an environment. The environmental things about retreat are just to get away from those, actually. Temporarily make it easier to get away from those so that you can then apply those meditations more effectively. So if it's not doing that, then there's no point. Everything is about counteracting those afflictive emotions.
Sometimes when we slow down and we take away the busyness and the distraction in our life, which a retreat can do, those afflicted emotions can increase because we've been running away from it for so long. And now, when we face it, it becomes we see it so much more clearly how afflicted our mind is. And so it seems to me, just based on my own experience recently, that it might have to get worse before it gets better.
Actually, the teachings on, particularly with the teachings on developing concentration, meditation, the teachings on developing concentration in meditation, they actually address that directly. They actually say that if you start to do a retreat where you're trying to concentrate your mind, that the first stage or in the first stage, you can only keep your mind on whatever you're meditating on for very, very brief periods, and mostly your mind is not on that. Most of the time, your mind's not concentrating. There are different levels of concentration. But what they say actually is that at that first stage, they say it seems, just what you're describing, that it seems as though your distractions and your afflictive emotions have increased hugely. And then what the teachings say is actually they have not increased. What's happened is that you just weren't aware of them because you were doing it all the time, and that was your normal state. Now you're trying to concentrate, and so then you notice that happens. And then if you keep going, what happens is that gradually decreases. So yeah, that's a normal part of, or to become aware of that is actually a good sign. Sometimes people think, oh no, this is no good, I'm not, people say I'm not a good meditator or something, when they start trying to concentrate, especially in a retreat like that. But actually you should know in advance that that's a good sign, or is that's the good sign of that you've taken the first step, and that you're just starting to notice it. And it's almost like, what's the word, a small pond that's been very stirred up, with a lot of sediment and murkiness and so on. And so the first step is to notice, wow, it's stirred up, and you stop stirring it, and then you're just noticing how cloudy it is, and then very, very slowly it starts to settle. That can take varying lengths of time depending on circumstances and so on. But that's normal. That's the first step, so that's good. It's a good sign. But that's important in our practice too, is not to be discouraged by that, because just if you're not, if you're always distracted, which in our society is quite easy to be, then it's easy not to notice what's going on in your mind. Right? We're better than that than any other time in human history for sure, in terms of having available distractions. Right? Definitely one of the best. If you want to distract yourself, there's no better time in all of human history than right now. I think you can say that with definite confidence. So anyway, so then, so in a way, like even these 12 links of dependent origination that we're going to get to, I mean, those are antidotes actually, right? And that's another antidote to a number of different afflictive emotions. But okay, so then with any given afflictive emotion, like sometimes sometimes they'll list 1 or 2 or 3 different antidotes, but actually if you think broadly, then there are actually thousands, right? I mean, there are hundreds. So the more it's just the more you've studied like mind training teachings or stages of the path teachings or other teachings, then you can see there are so many different antidotes. And so there are a few things then that I think are useful, so that I'll just say, and then we're going to do some exercises with this a little bit before we go on to dependent arising. And so I think what's important is a few things. One is you have to study, right? So you have to know a few antidotes to get afflictive emotion. Then you have to know which afflictive emotions you have a lot of that you're trying to work on. And then you have to decide for yourself, almost like like your own treatment plan or something. There may be a lot of good, like for example, if somebody has high cholesterol, right? Well, there are a lot of different possible treatments. The same thing, right? You can change your diet in various ways. There are different diets that are recommended, right? For different, sometimes different books suggest different diets for cholesterol. Then there's like exercise, right? And then if the person's going to take, then there are like natural supplements, and then among medications, there's so many medications for that, right? That a doctor can choose from. But so any one person can't do all those at once, right? They would actually then their health would get worse, right? If you took every medication and every supplement at the same time, right? Totally mess up. And so for us, I think we have to study enough to know, okay, what are some antidotes to this afflictive emotion? But then we have to make a plan for ourselves. Okay, which ones am I going to try for a while and see how I do, and which ones work for me right now, and then you apply different ones over time. Because if at the same time you're trying to apply 7 or 8 antidotes, you're just going to get confused, right? And that doesn't mean you only have to do one though, because you can have also. Sometimes I like this idea is that you have like almost like a plan of. I'll give an example. Like let's say, I'll pick an example of anger, right? So let's say if you can catch the anger at the very first instant, so something. Let's say you have a tendency if somebody provokes you, or traffic, or your partner, or something like that, then you tend to get angry, right? So you can have your own plan like this, like, okay, if I can catch the anger right before it arises, when I'm just about to get angry, then I can just stop and say, oh wait a second, I don't want to go there, and I can just sort of focus, let it go and just focus on the present moment and just be mellow. Now, if the provocation is not very big, and if you really do happen to catch it that fast, then that's fine, right? That's enough. But if that's your whole plan, then that's not good enough, right? Because oftentimes you're not going to catch it at the very beginning, or the provocation's too big, or you're too habituated to the afflictive emotion, right? And so then there are like, so then you have to decide, right? Like there are so many different, what's the word? Contemplations, right? So so if we're taking the example of anger, then you could look at like it's like a, what's the word? Like a whole buffet in a way of options, and you decide which ones you want to use, right? So with anger, I'll just give a few examples. Like one would be, actually, well, so one is a traditional one is love, actually, right? In other words, so if so if I catch myself feeling angry, I'm going to meditate on love for the other person. Like so, thinking, may I and this person who I'm feeling angry at both be happy, may we both have peace, may we both. And then I'll do that, so I'll do that kind of meditation. You can even like do the whole meditation of love, like visualizing light rays of loving kindness surrounding you and surrounding that person, right? Thinking, may they be safe. So, so somebody cuts you off on the road, you start to get angry at them, and then instead you stop, let's say you can't stop it and let it go. So then you start meditating like that as you're driving. May I be safe, may that person be safe. May they get home safely, may their family be safe. May I get home safely, may my family be safe. And so on, right? That's one possible antidote. That's reasonable, right? It's actually a much better way to drive anyway, thinking like that. Then another way, right, is actually to think also, this is different than love. We actually, in a way, you could call it to think empathically, right? To recognize, actually, there are many, right? Another one's go, well, I've done the same thing that person's done, right? And you can then empathize. Why are they doing that? Well, they're in a hurry, or they didn't see me, or they didn't realize it, right? And we're the same. Actually, we all do things like that sometimes. We all make mistakes. There's no point getting angry, right? Then even if you think, okay, they are being belligerent, it's one of those people, that's harder, right? The person is really like doing whatever, right? So there's one Shantideva talks about, right, where he says, well, why do I get angry at the person? Then he goes through analysis, right? Like in his case, he used the example of a stick, but actually you can do it like this. You can think, well, am I angry at the tire of that car? Is it the tire's fault? It's not the tire's fault, but then again, that couldn't have happened if there weren't a tire, right? Is it the axle's fault? Am I angry at the axle? Well, that'd be kind of silly. You'd be angry at an axle for that, right? And then you can say, well, am I angry at the person's hand? Am I angry at the person's foot? Well, the foot was what was pressing on the gas, so is that it? Just that, which part of the foot am I? You can start analyzing, right? And then what Shantideva comes down to is he says to be angry at the person. Then you say, okay, no, I'm angry at the person. I'm not angry at their foot. I'm not angry at their tire. Then he says, well, actually, he points out that first of all, there is no person independent of the body, right? The parts of the body and then the mind. And he says, actually, the main thing is the person's delusions, right? That maybe their anger, right? So he says, so then am I just angry at their anger, right? Because actually, it's not reasonable to be angry. He points out that the tire was controlled by the hand, right? Or he doesn't point that out, but I'm using his analogy. He was talking about tires because he didn't have a car. But in other words, the tire was controlled by the hand, right? And the hand was controlled by the arm. The arm was controlled by the the brain, let's say, right? But if you keep tracing it back, then you say, well, then the cause of that behavior was anger. Well, the cause of the anger was ignorance. Okay, so don't be angry at the person, be angry at ignorance. Right? And then you say, well, okay, so if I'm angry at ignorance, how do I destroy ignorance? Well, I can't destroy that person's ignorance. I have to destroy my own. Then maybe I can become enlightened and help that person too. Okay, great. I'll generate bodhicitta. Right. So that would be another way. That's a contemplation, right? So you'd be driving along contemplating like that. So then there are many. You see, I'm getting at there. Those are just three. But then another one is just to think about the disadvantages of anger, right? So as you're driving, you think, wow, I don't want to dwell in anger anymore. And then you use that instance, right? You say, wow, look how it disturbs my mind. You actually do introspection, right? You say, wow, look at this. As soon as I'm getting angry, it's disturbing my mind. If I stay like this, I'll disturb everybody around me. Wherever I go, I annoy people if I'm like that. And then like the teachings say, right? And it creates so much negative karma. Actually, anger is the worst of all the afflictive emotions in terms of destroying good karma and creating bad karma, right? My mind is agitated. You don't sleep well. You don't eat well, right? I'll get home and eat, and then I won't digest it well if I stay like this. So it becomes like a teaching, right? Like in other words, in theory, you could say those things about anger, but actually that person's now your teacher, right? Oh, wow, they're showing me how destructive and hurtful anger is, right? And if I dwell in anger enough, then you create so many problems. Actually, over time, it can create so many problems, right? Where you can harm people and things like that. Anyway, so there are lots of things, right? So you can't do all those at the same time, obviously, right? So then you choose, right? Which one do I want to do? Yeah.
I've been thinking about this because we started talking about last week all these antidotes, and the thing that strikes me about it seems like such an intellectual approach, and I'm just wondering about that. Is Buddhism advocating that we use our intellect to dismantle the afflictive emotions? Is that the most powerful tool that we have in our arsenal?
Yeah, actually it is. I mean, if you, it's interesting, right? If you, like, to me that's quite interesting because if you, sort of say it, sometimes in the West it could seem like, and actually, like sometimes people misunderstand Buddhism actually and think that it's almost like, what's the word? There's some quotes where it can almost seem anti-intellectual or something like that. And there are some quotes like from, I was just reading about this where people misunderstand, for example, Nagarjuna. Like, because Nagarjuna sometimes said, I have no views, right? If I grasp at a view, then, then I would be at fault. But I don't grasp at any views, and therefore I'm faultless. Things like that, right? And sometimes people misunderstand that and think that means like, well, just space out, dude, or something like that. Get into some kind of vibration and just don't think of anything, and that's enlightenment. Actually, in the West, people think that, but actually, some people in Tibet thought that. Actually, there were people. The West is not unique in having that wrong understanding of Buddhism. Like sometimes, actually, if you go around, you'll hear people talk like that, though. Like just empty your mind, and your mind is like there's nothing. If there's nothing in your mind, that's emptiness, or like if your mind is like space, then that's emptiness, and then you're liberated or something. And but people in Tibet thought that kind of stuff too, and so actually first people in India thought that, right? And then because Nagarjuna didn't mean that. It's very clear actually if you read him carefully. But then sometimes in Tibet people thought, so then like Chandrakirti came along, and first of all in India, and clarified. But then still Tibetans thought that way. Many Tibetans thought that way. And then Lama Tsongkhapa, actually if you study his teachings, he was like, he actually said he would say things like, not only is that person, what's that we say? Like sometimes people say, oh, I'm studying the middle way because I think that way, and actually Lama Tsongkhapa would say, actually not only are you not studying the middle way, you're actually not practicing Buddhism. That's some other, he would say that's not even a Buddhist view actually, it's some other view, and it doesn't lead anywhere. Actually, it's any place good, it's a total waste of your time, that kind of, like Lama Tsongkhapa was quite clear on that point. And even after Lama Tsongkhapa people thought that, and then other teachers. So now if you go, so now who's the best person to hear that from is the Dalai Lama actually. He's very clear on this point. And first of all, he points out that that's not emptiness. But then also, like, he points out that it's reason, actually, right? The Dalai Lama, if you go hear him lecture, as you go, he travels all the time, right? And he's always comes to America twice a year, usually, nowadays. And he always is talking about that, right? The idea, so often he emphasizes this idea of the value of reason, right? And he says that, like, when he talks about he says if you're going to practice Buddhism, be a 21st century Buddhist, right? He says, which means study and use analysis and use reasoning, and so that's really his emphasis so much, actually. So of course, if you want to understand emptiness, you have to use reasoning, actually, right? To refute your, because the idea there is you have to find your own wrong views, but I guess so, or if you want to counteract anger, desire, any of these. But then I want to emphasize another point with that is that. So you do have to use reasoning, but then also in practice, the idea is not, there's a difference between using reason and sort of like over-intellectualizing. And those are two different things also. So I just want to emphasize that. In other words, when you're reading a teaching, like when we cover dependent origination later, this is one thing I was really thinking about, actually, when I was thinking about presenting, is that when you first are going to study something like that, it is a bit of an intellectual exercise. In other words, well, what is the definition of this, and how does it relate to that, and how do these 12 things interact, and that you can do them in reverse order, and things like that. So it can seem a bit intellectual, just like these teachings on the faults of anger, or the faults of craving, or desire, or attachment, and dependent origination, and so on. And at the beginning, so actually I want to go through this. So there are 3 steps, though, actually. So this is quite important. The first step is study, right? So the study phase is somewhat intellectual. Like in other words, and sometimes people like confuse that. Like, if you hear like teachings, right? Well, there is an intellectual aspect to that because that's the point, right? You're just trying to understand something new that you didn't understand before. So that's a bit of an intellectual exercise. But next, in other words, if you leave it there, that becomes like actually somebody told me this story recently. They went to the Dalai Lama. They had like a personal meeting, and they said, "Oh, I've been studying such and such text." And they said, I've been studying it like this, I've been studying it like that. And the Dalai Lama said, well, has it benefited your mind? Have you had less afflictive emotions? And the person, well, no. You know, like, because the reason that's not good enough, right? That's the point that I was making. So that's the first step, is intellectual study, right? To gain an understanding of something. But then the second step is contemplation. And that's what we're trying to start doing in these classes, really, I think. And I want to say what contemplation is, because I think in the West we can have a misunderstanding of that. Contemplation, so the first stage is study, right? So in other words, even if you're reading a book, right, and you're saying, okay, now what is the definite, like, what is that? How does it relate to this? That's still study, right? That's not really contemplating yet. That's studying, which means I'm trying to get an intellectual grasp of the topic. But then when you contemplate, it should become experiential in your own, you should really be feeling it. So that's where, in other words, you've already studied and gained some intellectual idea, but then you're starting to have like anger arising, and you're actually going, okay, I'm going to try this. Let's see what happens. Wow, I feel different. You know, oh, that's how that works. Like now it's working in my experience. Now I get it through my own, like, digesting of those teachings, right? Or like the ones on emptiness, right? Where you actually have to feel, like, you know, so somebody insults you, right? And then you go home and you think, okay, meditate. You have that sense of something in your chest that's really bothering you, and then you start applying reasoning, and you see what happens, you know. And if that feeling in your chest starts to dissolve, where you feel like, wow, there's not, like, wow, what's going on? I suddenly feel like there's nothing, like I'm not even here, and then you stop. Oh no, I'm here. No, wait, how am I here? You start having some kind of experience like that. You know, that's contemplation. So it's no longer intellectualizing. It's kind of like a very experiential, personal process of trying to like apply the teachings to your own real experience in daily life. You know, and like, you know, and to your own past experiences and present experiences. And then when you get to meditation, right? So you've already done the contemplation thing, right? You've already done that for months, right? You've sort of been like struggling with those things and applying them in your, you know, so you go home at night and you sort of go over the day and you're applying those teachings, right? You're saying, wow, when I got like all caught up in that today and I thought it was so important, you know, and like you start going, wow, like I wasn't realizing impermanence and death at all. Like that has no meaning at all. Like how silly I am, you know, like, wow, look at that. And, you know, the reality is I could die any second, and yet I'm so caught up in this petty stuff, and like, look how that happens, and you start like really feeling it. You know, that's contemplation still, right? Where you're sitting there going, wow, how can I believe that? You know, like sometimes you can almost start laughing. You know, it's like, wow, how could I have done that? Like I know impermanence, and yet look how caught up I was in this. And you start to hold these two views. I have this view of permanence that I'm instinctually habituated to, and then I'm gaining this wisdom of impermanence. And they start to, you know, you see they're contradictory, right, in your own experience. You know, whereas when I'm recognizing impermanence, I couldn't possibly get caught up in that petty stuff. When I have this view of permanence, then everything seems, you know, like, then what I think when I see impermanence seems totally irrelevant at that moment. You know, like I don't see any of that. And then you start like applying the view of impermanence to your, again, to counteract your view of permanence, right, in your own experience. So that then even as you're going through the day and you start getting caught up in something and you're starting to, this is where then you really start to apply it. This is still contemplation, right? Where you're going around during the day and you're reminding yourself throughout the day, you know, okay, I'm going to this meeting. Remember, I could die any second. Don't focus on anything petty. Focus on what's really important in life. You know, you go on your way to work. You're walking, you know, in the door, and you're thinking, you know, today could be my last day of my life. You know, I'm going to work to benefit others and to gain some wisdom. I'm not going to work for something superficial. You know, so you start applying that contemplation more and more and more, right? So then you reach a level of meditation, right? So I really think it's reasonable to say this then. Then at the point of meditation, like, oftentimes it's very few words. You know, it still can be, there's still an intellectual reasoned component, but at that point you've already familiarized yourself with it. And so they often say then it could just be like, so we say, because you've already studied well and contemplated deeply in daily life, you know, then you don't have to go through the whole thing of, well, is it the, you know, whatever. Whereas if you've gotten good at the contemplation, right, then a brief reminder brings you to, so you're sitting and concentrating, and a brief reminder brings up the actual experience of, let's say, take the example of impermanence, right? If you've contemplated the 9, you know, like there are 9-point death meditation, there's like, you know, observation, there are all kinds of things, watching a waterfall fall and saying moments are passing like that, and watching the clock go by and saying every second that goes by I'm 1 second closer to death. You know, you've done those things over and over and contemplate. You know, then if you sit down to meditate, you can just go, you can just think, you know, that which arises, you know, you could just think everything that arose due to causes and conditions changes instant by instant. and you feel it, right, about yourself, and then you concentrate on that, and you keep your concentration there. You know what I mean? So then you're not contemplating anymore really much at all. You're just holding your mind on this already, something you've already realized, actually, right? So once you have the realization of that, or a recognition of that, then meditation means that you're not actually intellectualizing at all at that point. You know, if you can keep your mind there, right? You're just focusing your mind on what you've already understood. And by focusing your mind deeply on that, you're familiarizing yourself with it until that becomes your baseline way of relating to the world. So at that point, there are very few, like, in other words, there's still a reason. There's still the use of, at that point, it's still a recognition based on reasoning, but at that point, there's not a whole lot of thought required to get to the point because you've already thought about it.
So in the meditation, when you're sitting there, and you said you're holding your mind on what you already understood.
Mm-hmm.
Are you concentrating on that knowledge, that wisdom, or are you clearing your mind and just being, you've understood it, you've understood impermanence, and then something opens up, like a spaciousness might arise because you realize that nothing, whatever you were focusing on is really just doesn't matter. So then, is that an experiential thing at that point, or is it still using the reason and the mind?
Certainly you're still using your mind. There's nothing else to meditate with, but that way. So you have to use your mind to meditate. But the idea would be this. I think a reasonable way to describe it would be this. Like earlier when we did the breathing meditation, right? What we did, right? We were focusing on our breath, right? The sensations of the breath, and then when your mind got distracted to other thoughts, you brought it back to the breath, right? So that, or other feelings, your mind might go off into, oh wow, I feel this way, or I have to do that thing, or I'm worried about this. And then you bring your mind back to the breath. With the kind of meditation, so what I'm talking about is almost a very similar process. But let's say the person has a recognition of impermanence for moment-to-moment change, right? So then, instead of focusing the mind on the breath, you actually focus your mind on that awareness of how things change moment to moment. You're not thinking, oh, things change moment to moment, things change moment to moment. That's not what I'm talking about. It's actually just an experiential recognition of that, an experiential understanding of that that's come from previously having thought about it. Right? And you hold your mind on that. Then if your mind drifts away to thinking about something else, just like before with the breath, in this case you catch it and you bring it back to that experiential understanding of impermanence. The only difference would be if you lose the understanding of impermanence, let's say, right? Let's say you're holding your mind on that awareness of impermanence and then you lose it. Well, then you may have to apply a couple reasons to bring it back, and then you focus your mind on it. Does that make sense?
So at that point you're just focusing.
Yeah, you're focusing your mind on an awareness of a particular thing. And focusing your mind on the awareness of impermanence is totally different than focusing it on, I'll give another example, focusing on love, right? So there you have to give rise to love, right? And then you just keep your mind in a state of love, right? There is where you if it goes to something else, you again, if you can get back to love immediately, you don't intellectualize actually, you just come back to love. If you've lost the feeling of love, right, then you use some reminders of, why be loving, or how precious others are, or how kind others are, or how, until you get to that space of love, and then you just keep your mind in a state of love. If the mind gets distracted, you bring it back. If it were emptiness, right, you generate the understanding of emptiness, and then you keep your mind completely absorbed in that, right? And if it gets distracted, you bring it back. It gets distracted, you bring it back. That's meditation, actually. So that's not, and you only, at that point, let's say then you try to bring your mind back to the understanding of emptiness, and you have no understanding of emptiness, at that moment. Well, then, of course, you have to apply some reasoning to get back to an understanding, but you can't do that until you have a pretty good Like, you can't really meditate on something well until you've contemplated a bit. So you have some kind of recognition of that thing, or experience of that thing. So with emptiness, same thing, right? So you would absorb your mind as much as you can in your understanding of emptiness. If you lose it, right? If you just get distracted, let's say you start to get distracted, but you still have it, well, then you just go, oh, no, I'm thinking about that, come back. Now if you've lost the recognition of emptiness, of course you apply some reasoning again until you get there, and then you just focus deeply, like completely absorbing your mind in that. So whether it's impermanence or emptiness or some other thing, so that's the difference between contemplation and meditation. They're different in that way. So does that make sense? And those are actually antidotes, right? And then the more you habituate yourself to that, then of course, and if you've been doing that, right? Well, then you have, like, give another analogy here. Like, the antidotes, and another way of describing them is like weapons against the afflictive emotions, right? And so I sometimes think it's like this. If like for most of us, like let's say you have a tendency towards pride or desire, or craving, attachment, something. Right? Oftentimes, for us, our afflictive emotion, right, like the pride or the attachment, is like what's it called? Is like a Himalayan mountain. It's that solid and that strong. And our antidote is like, have you ever seen those little tiny, like sometimes like on a keychain, like a, what's it called that, like let's say a tomahawk or something, like that you could buy at a cheap gift shop. That's like this, it's like made of plastic, and if you went like that, it would do. It's like sort of like our wisdom, the power of our antidotes is like that, and the power of our delusions is like a mountain. So you're kind of going like this, on the little rock on the mountain, and it's not really doing much. But if you meditate, right, the more you meditate on something, well, then it's like that it's growing and it's getting sharper, right? So it's easier to cut through the afflictive emotions. And then also, if you meditate, of course, the power of those afflictive emotions is going down, and the strength of your antidotes is going up, so you have a better chance at succeeding in cutting them when they arise. Otherwise, you can't blame a person, right? Sometimes we say that, like, I'm trying to apply the antidote, but it's not doing. Well, it's because we haven't studied much, we haven't contemplated a lot, we haven't meditated on it. And so we're trying, and that's good, but of course it's hard, because we're not familiar with those antidotes, and we're very familiar with the afflictive emotions, so it's, so it's an unfair fight at that point. And what we're going to do is slowly change that, but the only way to change that is by becoming familiar with these reasonings. And at the beginning, I'll say one more thing, and then one more thought I want to share is also, a lot of times people will say, well, the reasonings don't feel real to me. Like sometimes people say that, that doesn't feel real, but this feels real. Like my jealousy feels very real. My sadness or my rage, like that's totally, that's so real. But this other thing, like bodhicitta, seems like some kind of made up, like it's made up sort of like fiction, or I don't know, some like made up idea. Right? Well, that's just because what we're familiar with, right? And this is important actually, because this gets at your thing about your question about reasoning, is that what Buddhism is saying really is this, is that actually you're using reasoning all the time, but you're just so familiar with those reasonings that they seem totally spontaneous. So, like you just look at a particular phenomenon, and boom, it's so powerful, like your experience of the afflictive emotion, right? That's because you've already done your study and contemplation in the negative way. Whereas like, people, like you learned, you got familiar over like a long period of time with that particular afflictive emotion. And so for that, it's like with the slightest hint of a provocation, boom, it's right there, and it feels very solid and it feels very powerful. But that's because your mind is very familiar with those reasons, right? Like, whether it's from your own past karma, then your own active processes, then maybe lessons somebody taught you, like wrong things somebody taught you, then ways you like ruminated over and over again, and so on. And so the idea is, that's why one feels real and the other feels not real, is just you're not familiar with it, right? So as you familiarize yourself with these other states of mind, well, then the reverse happens, right? Eventually, this seems really real, and that seems sort of silly, And what the Dalai Lama points out is that, in one way, he doesn't say this, I'll say the first part and then I'll say the second part. What I would say is this, there are moments for an ordinary person like us where it can seem daunting, because it's like, wow, the afflicting emotions are so powerful sometimes, like it's so easy to give rise to so much like craving or something, and it seems sometimes I think for us, it can look like, and everything around us supports that. Our own mind supports it, my entire environment, my culture, my family, my friends, everything supports the afflictive emotions, and then it can look like, that the wisdom side seems like, well, there's so little support for it, and it seems very weak in my mind, and it doesn't seem very. But the Dalai Lama points out something quite important, which is, ultimately, wisdom has an advantage. The advantage is it's true, and the other side is false, actually. In other words, like, that as long as you apply reasoning, this is the importance of reasoning, in other words, as long as you actually apply the reasons and really think deeply, wisdom has that advantage, that it's telling the truth, whereas this side is actually wrong. In other words, it's incorrect. In other words, if you actually analyze the truth of a situation, the delusion side is exaggerating something, the wisdom side is telling the truth. And so you still have to make all the effort to familiarize yourself, but if you do familiarize yourself, what's I say this? It's like that advantage eventually helps. Or is it to become that you can gain a conviction and you can gain a what's I say this? Like a realization through reasoning. You can, in other words, through that process of reasoning, you can actually gain an inferential, true understanding, and then you can gain a direct insight into that. There's a direct seeing that's incontrovertible. That's sometimes the word. There's nothing can once you've gained the kind of, like for example with emptiness, once somebody's gained a correct, true realization of emptiness, especially if they gain direct insight into emptiness, nothing can ever contradict that. There's because, in other words, it's the difference between like, if somebody makes up a whole bunch of stories about what color this room is, right? Then once you've come here and you've looked and if you look carefully, like Jody did when she picked the paint, if you look and you actually analyze, you say, now I know what color. In other words, nobody can then tell me, no, when you were there that day it was purple. Whereas I can't be convinced of that because I saw it myself. So that's the advantage of that wisdom is telling the truth. But you only get there if you keep going far enough so that you have that, either the inferential or the direct realization of something. So there's an advantage to that. But we have to apply the reasonings. At the beginning it can seem hard, but if you keep applying those reasonings and sort of contradicting your old wrong views, then eventually the antidotes start to get easier to apply.
When you say truth, are you talking about really the suffering, right? One perpetuates suffering and one doesn't?
That for sure, but also there's something else there too, which is this, I'm going to take the example of, I'll take the example of permanence, the view of permanence, right? In other words, like, I'm going to pick that one because it's easier than emptiness to talk about. Like, one is for sure, like when we have a view of permanence, right? When we feel like, the feeling, we don't think this intellectually, but we have this feeling, I exist, I'm going to exist forever, and that person who's annoying me is like permanently annoying, right? Is some kind of a feeling that we get, right? So one is that causes, like you said, that causes a lot of suffering, for sure. But there's another, and Chandrakirti is very good about this, right? Whereas he says, he would say this, like not only does that view create a lot of suffering for us, but also it's just not true. Like in other words, if you analyze, actually you're not permanent. There's nothing about you that's permanent. There's nothing about that other person that's permanent. Every atom in their body is changing faster than you can measure it. Their mind is changing faster than, in other words, you can't even, you can't break it down slow enough. You can't, whereas we can't even see how fast it's changing. You know what I mean? Like the same way you can't see how fast an electron is moving. It's like it's moving so fast you can't even, you know what I mean? Like in other words, everything is changing instant by instant, and yet I'm imagining that it's permanent. Like it's a complete hallucination, really. Whereas like there's nothing permanent about it, and yet I'm imagining that it's permanent. So it's also that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Whereas and that and that when you come to that realization, whereas the other one, you can't ever realize that things are permanent because they're not. So you can have the view of that. You can punch somebody if they disagree with it. You can say, I believe it 100%. But the reality is that no matter what you do, the fact that you can punch them proves it's impermanent, right? Like in other words, you're moving your hand, and that's because it's made up of all these things and so on. And when you think, no, it's permanent, well, that's already proving. Actually, if you analyze it, even your thought, no, this is permanent, proves it's impermanent, right? Because you can give rise to that thought, and that thought includes, a lot of elements and so on. Just the words, right? So that's what I meant by that too. Is that if you apply reasoning, you can see not only does the wrong view cause suffering, but also each of the wrong views, each of those afflictive emotions, is simply wrong. Actually, in other words, it has a view about yourself and objects that's completely incorrect.
I have a question. And like in real life, if you're interacting with someone and you have like an argument and stuff, and the next day or they see you, they're like expecting you to have a grudge. And if you don't, they will get angry. Like, how do you deal with that? And they're like talking about you, oh, you act like nothing happened. And I have to remember, oh yeah, that's right, we had an argument, oh, I'm sorry, what do you do?
I'm over it now.
But so just make it so clear, so they get angry because you're not holding a grudge. Actually.
Yeah, you pass someone like you've had an argument or something went on, and you can just tell they're expecting it.
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, actually, I mean, that's more, so it's an interpersonal question. But actually, there are lots of options then, depending on how we want to practice. Like, but actually, so one would be, I mean, it depends, and also a lot of it depends on the person, who the other person is. But if you look at the mind training teachings, right, like the 8 verses of mind training, the 7 points of mind training, then those are very much about exactly that kind of question. And oftentimes, like, what those advise, right, is actually then thinking about the other person and thinking, well, what will help them the most? You know what I mean? Like, whereas that person is suffering. Like, you think, okay, I'm okay now. Like, in other words, we have this argument. I'm fine because I was able to practice patience, which is great. But then actually, if you really want to get into the mind training teachings, what you actually think of is you think this. Like, so for me, actually that person benefited me so much. Like, in other words, they helped me to practice patience, which helps me to become enlightened, right? But meanwhile, they've gotten hurt. In other words, like, because they don't know how to practice that. So they're still suffering, whereas I'm sort of free from suffering. And so in a way, they're like my kind helper, my teacher. Like, they're almost like my guru or something. You'd almost think that way. So you think they're the most precious one, actually, who is suffering. I benefit from them, and yet they got harmed from the interaction. So now how can I help them? Because that's I owe them something for their being so kind. And sometimes, like, I always think it's funny, sometimes Lama Zopa Rinpoche will talk about, like, he'll say, like, so bake a cake for the person, or so, like, he sort of, so actually, he usually tries that, like, but it's, I mean, there is, but if they don't like cake, then do something else. But you actually, like, or apologize, or correct something, or, but actually think what would they most like, like what would make them most happy in this situation, because they're so both suffering and also so helpful to me. And so you actually go out of your way to do something to sort of either correct the situation, or you can just say something to make it better, or you kind of go out of your way to be extra nice to them, or or say oh, I realize this and I want to be your whatever, like whatever that would be. It depends on the person, of course, But does that make sense? Kind of like So that's because actually, like, right, it says like in the 8 verses of mind training, it calls that kind of person a wish granting jewel, right? So you think that person is the wish granting jewel that gives every like they're the most precious thing in the universe, basically, right? Like, so it actually, you think that way. That's the mind training approach, which is cool. Right? If you can do it, it's really good. Right. So the mind training teachers are amazing antidotes, right? If we're talking about antidotes, those are like totally amazing, right? These amazing antidotes.
What does Lama Zopa means when he say that they give you enlightenment?
Because if you think about it, right? Like, if you want to become enlightened, right? Let's say if somebody generates bodhicitta, right? Then there are 6 practices. There's only 6, actually, right, that you have to do to become a Buddha, right? Giving, generosity, ethics, patience. Right, the third one is patience. So actually, Shantideva says in his Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. So if you have to do those, and then there's joyful effort, concentration, and wisdom. Those are the 6 perfections, right? So then Shantideva says, actually, you can't. Each of those you need other, especially the first few, you need other people, right? Shantideva points out, if you want to practice generosity, right, well, you need people who need something. Right? Like, in other words, if everybody has everything they want, if there's nobody who's in need, then it's very difficult to practice generosity. People are like, leave me alone. I don't want like, you're trying to give something, you're actually annoying them. It's no good, Like, so having people in need really helps for generosity, right? Then for ethics, actually having people who tempt you is good, right? Like having people come along and say, oh, why don't you do this? And then you say, no, thank you, I'm not interested in that anymore. Or, no, I don't want to do that, Then that helps you to perfect your ethics, right? So for patience, Shantideva says, actually what you need is difficult people. You need like people like who create problems for you. Otherwise, you can't practice patience. He points out, like, it's no help at all. If everybody's nice to you, right, then that's no help at all for practicing patience. So he says, like, you totally need people who are rude or angry or difficult, and so Shantideva says, actually, there's a problem in a way. He points out that somebody who's practicing the bodhisattva path and is always living with compassion, then there's a problem, which is that they tend to have less and less enemies, right, because they're nice to others, so others treat them. So then he says, so then if you come across, finally you find somebody who's difficult, then they're like so precious because now I can practice patience, So Shantideva is like, he talks like that, where he says, then you're so happy to come across the difficult person because you think, oh, this way I can practice patience. Without them, I'll never become a Buddha, right? Like, because nobody ever became enlightened. If you want to become an actual Buddha, right, you have to practice 6 perfections. Nobody ever did that without practicing patience, right? But for patience, you can't do it on your own. You need difficult people that treat you bad. And so that's what Lama, so Lama was saying, so you need that person there giving you enlightenment, like, and for themselves, like, they're maybe miserable, right? But for you, they're helping you so much, so then you actually feel so much compassion because they're helping you to become enlightened, actually. Does that make sense? Yeah, and it's absolutely impossible, right? So, that story, people heard that story, right, of Atisha? Like, they say that Atisha, right, the great Indian Buddhist master, that when he went to Tibet, he had this, like, attendant, like, who traveled everywhere with him, who was, like, incredibly obnoxious. Like, really, like, one of those kind of people who always made problems for everybody, and Atisha was, like, very close to him, and always kept him close to him, and, like, everywhere he went, he, like, kept him, like, like, right there. And then finally, after years, I guess, he sent him back. The attendant was Indian, right? And he said, and then finally he said to the Indian, okay, you can go back. And then this Tibetan said, like, wow, that guy was so annoying. Like, why'd you keep him around so? And why'd you send him back now? And he said, I needed him to practice patience, but now that I know the Tibetan people well, and he said that I didn't need him anymore. Because the Tibetans were not so well then, not so well tamed. He said, so now I have enough other people, so it's okay. Go back to the monastery or something. But anyway, so we need difficult people for that reason.
I don't always need difficult people. I can practice patience with myself.
That's good. That's it. Actually, there are 3 types of patience. So, so not all of them. Only one type applies to other. One type. There's one type of patience that's what's it called? The patience of dealing with difficult others. Then there are other kinds. Like you're describing. Gosh. Okay. So what time? It's other questions actually. That's more important.
Just had a question.
Oh yeah. We never got to yours. That's right.
Oh, I was just gonna say, when you were talking about the antidotes and everything, is the one thing I didn't hear you mention is like shamatha or like concentration, because it seems to be like the other side. I mean, if you're meditating on impermanence or something, if you're distracted every second, you might only be soaking in that realization of impermanence for a minute out of your half-hour meditation or something. Whereas if you had concentration, you'd be getting more time, more whatever you want to call it. And I know like those things can be taken as objects of shamatha, but would you say that applying these antidotes and like clearing up some of the power of the afflicted emotions naturally brings the concentration, or do you need to practice more pure shamatha like parallel to that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say 2 things. One is that shamatha in and of itself actually makes it so much easier to, like you're applying for a number of reasons. One is like this, is that the more you develop shamatha, like your mind is more tranquil, right, by its very nature. There's by the nature of shamatha, not its nature of mind permanently, but as long as you're doing that, right, your mind is more peaceful, so you have fewer afflictive emotions arising, because your mind is sort of more calm, it's more concentrated, and so you're not doing as much of that. Now, shamatha in and of itself is not a permanent solution by itself, but that's one huge advantage, right? Is as anybody, if they develop like concentration, they just become so much more peaceful, right? So then fewer afflictive emotions are arising, so it's much easier to counteract them. But then also, yeah, like you're saying, once you have better concentration, then of course the better your concentration is, then when you meditate, you still have to use reasoning if you want to then use it to meditate on impermanence or on emptiness or whatever. But they sometimes some teachers have used this analogy. They say if you want to cut down a tree, it's similar to the analogy I used before. In this case, now you have a full-sized axe, right? And if you want to cut down a tree, they say there are 2 things. Like one is you have to have strong arms, and the other is you have to have a sharp axe, and you need both, right? Whereas even if you have an incredibly sharp axe, if you can't swing it, it's not going to cut down the tree, and vice versa, right? Whereas even if you have very strong arms, if your axe is like, shaped, if it's like that, it doesn't matter how strong, you're just going to keep whacking it, and nothing's going to happen. So you need both, and the analogy there is that the strong arms are like shamatha, and there is that's like having the ability, and then the sharp axe is having had the reasoning that has the penetrative insight. And so if you have those 2 combined, then it's easy to, like you're describing, is to cut through a delusion.
Kind of my question is the meditations like you were describing, is in your examples, do they cover both, or do you need to do separate shamatha practice?
Yeah, no, those cover both. And so, like, you can choose, like I guess in daily life, you be using, or we should be developing our shamatha in those examples, right? So as you're meditating on Lam Rim, use shamatha as part of that. Then there comes a point, where if you're trying to really cultivate shamatha, what's the word? Like progress through different levels to develop very deep, calm abiding meditation. Well, then that's different. Whereas then you have to pick one object, because now I was describing where you might one day meditate on impermanence, the next day on emptiness, the next day on love, and of course one does that, and one does develop concentration through those things, right? But let's say you might go through a few levels of concentration, but then if you want to, let's say you got to level 4 or 5 or 3 or something, there are 9 levels of developing calm abiding. There might come a time where a person goes into retreat to really, like you're describing, develop true calm abiding. At that point, the person would choose one object. But it could be, like if the person has realized emptiness, they can choose emptiness, for example. If one hasn't realized emptiness yet, then one might choose the image of a Buddha, or might choose the nature of, the conventional nature of mind that's clear and knowing, that's Mahamudra. One can choose different, one chooses a particular object, whatever one, but it's up to oneself which object to choose. And then you stay with that one object. Just as just as you pick one just to use as an object in order to develop the levels of calm abiding. But then once you gain calm abiding, you go back and you use it to meditate on all those other subjects again. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. But there comes a point in retreat where you have to pick one up. Because they say if you're in retreat developing calm abiding, you have too many different objects, then it doesn't, it gets in the way of developing that, the really deep concentrated state.
In this tradition, do they say that to have any real realizations, you have to have shamatha as a prerequisite?
No, you don't. Because it's very clear in the teachings that you can, for example, you can gain an inferential, not the direct cognition, but an inferential realization of emptiness, which is very powerful. Without a person doesn't have to have calm abiding. You can realize bodhicitta without calm abiding. And those are huge, right? You can develop, and you can realize renunciation, for example, also which comes before bodhicitta, but you can realize that without calm abiding. So there are lots of realizations you can gain before you've realized calm abiding.
Is shamatha and calm abiding the same thing?
Let's see, yeah. And there was something else I was going to say about it too, yeah, and many times what people will do, actually in the Glugpa tradition, oftentimes what many of the story at least is that many of the yogis actually will develop those, will gain the renunciation, bodhicitta, and the inferential recognition of emptiness. And usually at that point they go off to retreat. Actually in the Glugpa tradition, there are other exceptions. There are many people, everybody has their own path, but many times that'll happen. Somebody will, meditating on Lam Rim in daily life and in their, in short retreats, they'll gain the realization of renunciation, of bodhicitta, and an inferential realization. It's not direct, but just sort of, through study and contemplation. And then they go off to do retreat to realize, because then it's easy to become, then it's quite easy to gain calm abiding because they have those other realizations, and then they use that to.
So how long does calm abiding takes, to gain?
But the teachings say that if you've studied well and understand well how to do it, that it can be 6 months of retreat to realize it. That's what they say.
What, every day, all day?
Yeah, I mean, if somebody goes into a calm abiding retreat, then that's their main focus. It's not that they just sit there all day, but I mean that they go because often you start with shorter sessions and things. But the teachings say that usually for a person who's ready to do a calm abiding retreat, that it's quite possible to realize. And there are some people who realize it faster, but then there are other people it takes a couple of years. It depends on the person. But that they say that shouldn't be that difficult in 6 months if you're the right person who has the right preparation.
Venerable George mentioned a really good book on the retreat for that, and I forgot what the name of it was.
I think it was Alan Wallace's book.
Was it? It's in blue, I think.
Or the shamatha?
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's literally how to do the retreat. It's not a long book.
His book is Lam Rim.
Lam Rim,
Yeah.
Yeah, that describes it. I mean, the teachings on calm abiding are many. There are many books that teach. I don't know. I mean, Alan Wallace has done a number of books on that. All the Lam Rims, all the major Lam Rims have teachings on it. And then there's a book, by Genlam Rinpa about that.
That's the one.
I think it's Genlang Rinpa with Alan Wallace.
Okay, yeah, Genlam Rinpa did a really nice book on calm abiding too. I think it has special insight in it too, actually, but it's a very good book on that. So, and he was very clear.
Are there places you can go for a 6-month retreat?
Oh, sure. Yeah, even there's a place called Land of Calm Abiding in California that's just for that. That Lama Zopa founded. Lama Zopa Rinpoche founded it, and it's just it's really just for that. It's for people who want to do calm abiding, that kind of retreat. And there are other places too. But yeah. So just you have to, there are requirements that are described in the texts. Where it says the do common body interchange should be a place very quiet, of course, where there aren't a lot of disturbances, where there are other people meditating, or where there's somebody bringing you food. Just practical stuff like that. Obviously, if there's a lot of noise, it's not going to work to develop. It's going to be very difficult to develop really deep concentrations. So, there are lists of things. And the land of common body is one. Yeah. But there are other places, even in the U.S., and then there are places, of course, in India too. So I have a question for you guys. We have 45 minutes left, and
Dependent origination now.
yeah. So the question is, do you guys want to do dependent origination now, or because the other thing we could do is some kind of an exercise about the afflictive emotions and sort of we sometimes do that. We don't really have time to do both. So what do people prefer? Dependent origination. Okay, so we'll start dependent origination. So I brought a graphic, right, of the wheel of life, they call it, right. And so this actually, I'll just say, share this too. The wheel of life actually was actually comes from the time of the Buddha himself. So he had an artist in India draw this during, not this particular one, of course, but this image during his lifetime. And so actually the center, we've already been talking about the other parts of it. We have the outer rim is the 12 links of dependent origination, right? What this is showing is samsara, right? The wheel of life is like a symbol of samsara. So of course, samsara exists where? Within the mouth, within the grasp of the Lord of Death is the symbolism there, right? So the symbol, this demonic image, right, just symbolizes death itself, right? So in other words, that we're always within the grasp of impermanence and death. That's the symbolism of the outer being holding the wheel of life, right? And in the middle is sometimes it's pictured slightly differently. So it's a pig, a rooster, and a snake. Right? Usually the
Weird looking pig.
yeah, it's an odd looking pig too, or boar. Maybe it looks more like a boar, that one. But really the boar or the pig symbolizes ignorance. The snake symbolizes anger. And that's supposed to symbolize desire, but anyway, the three roots, right? In other words, the three root delusions is in the center, right? Because they're the hub of the wheel of samsara, right? Where he said that ignorance is the actual hub, but then from ignorance arise desire and anger. The next rim shows, some beings going up and some going down. So that's showing the karmic process, right? Positive karma. You're still within samsara, but some are going up to better realms, some are going down to lower realms, but they keep going around and around regardless. And these are the 6 realms of existence, right? Humans, animals, hell, hungry ghosts, demigods, gods. Anyway, so our focus for today, though, is the 12 links of dependent origination, which start at the top here with the blind man. And so there are 12 links. Actually, I just remember this. When one time I think it was at Kopan, Lama Zopa Rinpoche was teaching on this, topic. I think for days he was saying it's absolutely essential to understand dependent arising, and he was describing the benefits. And then I think after about 4 or 5 days, this woman says she misunderstood. Rinpoche has an accent, from Nepal and right. And so she says, Rinpoche, for days you've been saying in order to become enlightened you have to understand Tibetan rice. And in order to and if you understand Tibetan rice, then you'll be liberated from all suffering. And Tibetan rice is the key to all happiness. And she says, what is the thing about Tibetan rice? Dependent arising and Tibetan rice, she misunderstood. So it's not Tibetan rice, it's dependent arising. You imagine sitting there for 4 or 5 days. Yeah, that's supposed to be something right. I'm having the rice every day. Every day I go to lunch and there's no. And the 12 links of Tibetan rice. But okay, so the first, so these 12 images around the outer edge, and you can look at it, at the end, but represent the 12 links of dependent origination. And so the first of the 12 links, the images of a blind man, and it symbolizes ignorance, not seeing reality, right? So it's a symbol of that. And in this, so I guess I'll start just by presenting what they are. I mean, then what's really important, right, which we'll start today and maybe we'll get to next time too, is how do you actually use this as an antidote, right? So, but like we said, first you have to understand it intellectually, right, or else you can't contemplate it. So I guess we'll have to, why don't we do it in that order, I guess. So I'll sort of present it more first, what are they, and then we'll sort of discuss how do you contemplate to make this experiential, because that's important, I mean, otherwise it doesn't benefit you. Because sometimes with this one, again, people could just understand it intellectually but not meditate on it, and then it doesn't help, but you have to understand it first, right? So okay, so ignorance, right, is the first link, and it's the cause, right? So in other words, ignorance is the cause of, I mean, is an essential cause of suffering, right? We've already said that. In this sense, though, there are ignorance can imply two kinds of ignorance. One is ignorance of causality, right? So infinite ignorance about how causality works, which mainly means you're ignorant of karma, right? Of how does karma work, right? And then there's the other ignorance, which is the ignorance that grasps at the mind and body as I and mine, right? So that's the ignorance grasping at true existence. Does that make sense? So those are two different kinds of ignorance. That first link symbolizes. And that the second link, which is the image of a potter making a pot, right? So like what do you call it, like a potter, or what do you call those people who spin, like this?
Ceramicist?
Yeah, ceramicist. I don't know what you call it. Anyway, people who make things like that. So the second image is of somebody making a pot, and that one symbolizes call it karmic formation, karmic formations or immature karma, and so on. And I want to explain something about that. Like, so what they're talking about in this part, right, is that due to ignorance, one creates karmic causes, right? That's what that's explaining. And what we're getting at here is what these 12 links are going to describe is how do we cycle in samsara, through birth and death, birth and death, birth and death. That's what these are describing. So that first link of ignorance, there is the one about ignorance of karma, right? Sometimes we have that and sometimes we don't. There is we can understand some about, we've already learned some about karma, so we know something about that. But the ignorance grasping at true existence, grasping at the aggregates, the body and mind as I and as mine, that we ordinary beings have all the time. And that one you become free from when you achieve the direct insight or direct realization of emptiness. So when you gain the path of seeing, right? I said before there are 5 paths. So when somebody gains the path of seeing, they see emptiness, the true ultimate nature of reality directly. So this is quite interesting, it's just useful to know, is at that point, the person has seen emptiness directly, so they no longer believe anymore. There is an I, or a truly existent I still appears to them, but they no longer believe in it because they've seen the truth, that doesn't actually exist, that I. So at that point, the person no longer has that kind of ignorance, so they no longer create karma for new rebirths in samsara. They still have past karma, but that's when you stop creating new karma for rebirths in samsara, because this second link, karmic formations to take further rebirths in samsara, depends on that kind of ignorance.
Sorry, what did you say? How do you create karma for future rebirths?
So karma for future rebirths means, that what this is getting at is this, is so based on either just the grasping at a truly existent I and mine, or it can include also karma, ignorance of karma, right? Ignorance about the nature of causal relations. Either one. It can include both, or it can just include ignorance of ignorance grasping at a truly existent, self-grasping, grasping at a truly existent I and mine, right? Based on that, one does actions, right? And so that's it. We'll continue because this is described. So based on, let's assume, for example, let's take the example of a positive action, because actually the one of ignorance of karma, they say then person only does negative. Actually, everything a person does creates causes of suffering. But let's assume I'm going to take the example of a positive karma. Okay, so let's say one is grasping at a truly existent I, right, and mind. But then one understands something about karma. Someone says, "Okay, I want to practice a little bit of generosity. I think that's a good thing to do. So I'm going to go give a gift." Right. So that's not negative, right? That's positive. So based on the ignorance grasping at a truly existent I, right? Let's say the person says, "Gosh, I want to make some good karma today," and so I'm going to be a nice person and I'm going to go give a gift. That's positive, right? It's fine. There's nothing. That's not a negative action. It's positive action, right? But it's still grounded in grasping it. This is really me. That's really them. This is really my stuff, and I kind of want to keep it, but I'm willing to give it away because I want to make some good karma, right? That's still grasping at truly existent, right? Still ignorance, grasping at a truly existent me, truly existent you, and a truly existent object. So there's not wisdom there. But the person's trying to create good karma. So I'll just give you an example, right? So they're grasping, they have ignorance, then they do an action, right, of giving in that case. So that relates to the third link, which is consciousness. And what that means really in this case is that so having given the gift, the imprint is imprinted on the consciousness, right? So there's a karmic seed that's imprinted on the consciousness through that act of giving. Does that make sense? So that's the third link. And the image of that is it's usually a monkey. It's a monkey jumping from house to house. Here it's just a monkey hanging out. Looks like.
How is that different from the second one? Sounds like the same thing.
Well, the second link is the action itself,
Oh, okay.
and then the third link is the
imprint.
the imprint on the consciousness. Or in this case, it says it's the imprint on the consciousness.
So when you say creating the causes for future rebirth, and then you get to a point where you realize emptiness. I'm just saying it back to you.
Yeah.
You realize emptiness, and then you no longer are creating the causes for future rebirth. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Because
there was because of these 12 links of dependent origination. In other words, the action, in order to create a cause for another samsaric rebirth, let's call it that, another rebirth in samsara, right? The action you're doing has to be conditioned by the first link, which is ignorance. Otherwise, it doesn't create the karmic. Otherwise, it doesn't create the kind of karma that leads to samsaric rebirth.
you're talking very kind of.
I get confused.
I'm just trying to bring
Yeah.
it down. I'm sure maybe others understand, but the question is, if I decide I no longer wish to create the causes for another rebirth, I mean, first of all, can I make that decision?
Actually, well, you can make that decision, but it won't work. In other words, like if I say I don't want this to create any, like if I say I don't want to create any more karma for rebirth, but I still have the first link of ignorance, right? Then without any choice, I am creating those causes. As long as I have ignorance, I can't help but create the
So
causes.
you're just talking about how this mechanism works.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter what you want.
No.
This is just the way the mechanism works.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a machine.
So if you cut through ignorance, you're reducing the causes for future rebirth.
Yeah.
But you may not be able to eliminate it entirely this lifetime.
Unless you realize emptiness directly, in which case, if you think about it like you're saying, it's a mechanism. That's exactly, you're getting exactly right. That's exactly it. And so at the point where a person has seen emptiness directly, if this is a machine that's, I'm using a metaphor here, right? If these 12 links if you take the metaphor, they're like a machine that's producing samsaric rebirths, right? Well, in that case, you just unplugged. This wasn't working before, it wasn't plugged in. Luckily, Mike, But that's the equivalent. In other words, you've unplugged the machine then. It may still run for a while, in a way, but it's no longer getting new. I'm just using a metaphor here. It's no longer getting new juice because it's ignorance that provides the. Ignorance is an essential element, just like the electricity is an essential element for this machine to work. Ignorance is an essential element for the 12 links of dependent origination to work in producing for more samsaric. New
I
samsaric.
realized from our discussion last week that I'm not going to get there this lifetime. I spent the whole week coming to Canada.
You don't know that.
But, I mean, seriously and not seriously. But I mean, but the question is then, what if this mechanism is in place, and maybe you can hold the question later if you don't want to answer it now. What can we realistically accomplish, given the state that we're in, the degenerate state that we're in, and the fact that we're so conditioned by our habituated, emotions, afflicted emotions? I mean, it seems to me that that we're, this discussion we're having, we're so far. Maybe I should speak for myself. I'm not speaking for anyone else. I'm so far from, being able to cut through many of these afflictions, that I'm wondering, what can I realistically take from this? And you can just hold the question if you don't want to answer it, or if you want to, you can answer it. That's you.
Well, I'll say one brief answer that I'll use this actually that Ken Rinpoche was emphasizing recently when he was teaching on the book that's coming out, the Easy Path. Is what he said is he said for us, for ordinary people, right? Like, in other words, it's very, you're right. In other words, it's not so easy. We can actually, it's possible, but it's not easy to destroy the hub, right? Or to crack it here at the point, to destroy ignorance. It's possible. In other words, we have a precious human rebirth. We have, all the teachings exist. The teachers exist. We have a kind of brain and a kind of mind, a kind of body, and all that can do that. So it's not impossible.
So
that's
from the large
important.
view, wouldn't you say we're very close to achieving it?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's reasonable
I mean,
to put it that way. Having a
take
precious
the large
human
view of
rebirth.
samsara, the causes and conditions that would get us this close.
As a human.
Right, that you have a precious
You're
human
human,
rebirth is amazing.
Precious human with a precious human rebirth and access to the teachings.
No, but
Yeah,
also
so you have this.
encountering the Dharma is a huge thing.
Right.
Anyway, finish what you were saying.
But so
Sorry.
but if no, so it is. I mean, so having a precious human
I'm trying
rebirth
to
is just
get
like that. But what Ken Rinpoche points out is this: is he says, at the minimum, he points out, like, because if you look in the Lam Rim, there are 3 scopes, right? The low scope is aiming for good future rebirths. The middle scope is what we're talking about here, which is to destroy the ignorance, right? To gain the, to destroy ignorance and therefore attain liberation. Right? Then there's the great scope, the Mahayana, to become a fully enlightened Buddha for the benefit of all sentient beings. But what he points out is that at minimum, it's actually not so difficult to at least do this, to at least make sure we don't go down, that we don't go down to the lower realms. So Ken Rinpoche points out that's not so difficult, right? Because for that, actually in the Lam Rim teachings, if you look, right, that's the minimum level of, Dharma practice, right? So like Ken Rinpoche pointed out, he said for that, if you take refuge, you develop faith, if you avoid the 10 non-virtuous actions, right? And if you do the 10 virtuous actions, then that's quite realistic, and you can develop confidence. Well, I won't take lower rebirth, and then I can continue practicing. If one feels, well, it's going to take many, it's going to take more than one lifetime, right? Whereas is to say, well, that's totally realistic. In other words, I cannot kill, I cannot steal, I cannot do sexual misconduct, I cannot lie. These are things that should be possible, right? For all of us. I cannot use harsh words and hurt people. I can stop that. Even if I have had a habit of that, in a reasonable length of time, that's totally. There's maybe if I have a habit of being harsh, or if I have a habit of lying or something, I may not be able to stop it completely in a day or two, but those are totally realistic, right? Like, in a reasonable time frame, we can get control of our behavior, And so I think it's an important point. That's why I think your question is a good one for us, right? Like, so even though it's going off from this, I think it's good to talk about a little bit. That's totally realistic, right? In other words, anybody can do those things, right? And anybody can start the process of decreasing our afflictive emotions, right? Whereas anybody can say, you know what, it's excessive. I have too much agitation, I have too much annoyance, I have too much jealousy, too much pride, too much. I can decrease those, And if I decrease those, and I take refuge, and I avoid those 10 non-virtuous actions, and I do virtuous actions, and then if so, I'm practicing ethics, right? And then I can be a little bit generous. I can slowly, give my time to others. I can give gifts. I can give, help to people who are really in need. Things, and I can be a little more patient, right? Because those 3 actually are essential, right? If you practice ethics, if you take refuge, right, that alone actually can stop you from going to rebirth in the next life. Right? But then if you, not if you
To
kill
lower,
people.
lower rebirth.
To lower rebirths in the next life. But then if you practice ethics, then it's obviously, if you're killing people, it's not going to work. You're not taking refuge if you're harming, because if you're going out and murdering, that's not taking refuge, because the Buddha said, nobody, what did he say? He said, I for countless lifetime, for 3 countless great eons, I worked, essentially, these aren't exact words, but the Buddha basically said, when I first generated bodhicitta, it was for the sake of others. My whole practice of the path was for the sake of others, and now that I'm a Buddha, I exist solely for the welfare of others. So if you harm others, then you're not venerating me. He said something like that. So that's clear. In other words, if you're harming others, you're not taking refuge. So, so if you take refuge, if you practice ethics, you practice some generosity, as much as you can, and you practice patience without getting angry. Those first 3, right? Those are things, first of all, that are easier for lay people to do, right? Whereas you don't have to develop deep concentration. Those you don't have to yet have calm abiding or anything of that sort. You don't have to do any retreat. To do those basic practices. Anybody can do those, right? And what the teachings say is that then, right, you're creating and then if you do a little bit, apply the antidotes as much as you can to decrease your afflictions and increase positive states. Anybody can meditate a little bit on love, right? A little bit on compassion, a little bit on like that. Then you're creating causes, first of all, to have a good rebirth in the future, and secondly, to keep practicing the path, right? And so that's totally realistic for anybody, and that's the baseline. But actually, and what the teachings say, this is why they're called, in the Lam Rim, it's called this, what's it called? It's not just called the low scope, but it's called practices in common with the low scope. So what it's saying is, bodhisattvas have to do that anyway, right? If you say I'm practicing Mahayana, I'm a bodhisattva, but I'm not going to do that, right? Well, that's, first of all, it's totally silly, right? Well, you're harming others, that's not bodhisattva, But secondly, like bodhisattvas also, if they don't become enlightened at life, right, they have to have good rebirths to keep practicing. So it's the same thing, right? They're creating the causes to have good future lives, still within samsara, right? But they're, having, so they can keep practicing and practicing until they do achieve direct insight into emptiness.
Can I just share with you the one thing that Dalai Lama said that helped me? That actually got me going with this, because I'm always trying to make it practical, figure out how we can talk about all these stages and calm abiding, whatever, but we may not be at a point where we can actually integrate them into our life. But with the Dalai Lama, I know this is going to sound really simple, but it was the start for me. He said, at the most practical level, he said, if you should approach your life this way. He said, if you're not able to go out and alleviate suffering for others, for goodness sake, don't cause any suffering to others. And that was practical. That was like something that, I pondered that for a year before I started getting more into it. But that's kind of where that's kind of the level that I'm at.
Well, it's perfect advice, isn't it? For anybody. You can't argue, you can argue, but you can't defeat the logic of that, right? Like, how stupid is it, right, to create more suffering for
So if you're not going to go out into the world and alleviate suffering, which is what you should be doing, at least don't cause. And most of us are still at the level where we're still causing suffering for ourselves and for others, let alone alleviating the suffering for others. Doesn't that make sense?
Can I say something, which I'm sure no one cares what I think, but this is the one thing that drives me crazy about Tibetan Buddhism, is there's this unspoken premise that no one's going to reach realization, like you can't reach realization unless you're like a reincarnated Lama. At least this is the impression I get. To me it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that I don't think is true. That we're so low spiritually that we're so that the best we can hope that we can hope for is to just maybe not have a completely meaningless life, or like it's like it seems like there's this assumption that no one can attain any real meaningful realization. I personally don't believe to be true, but and it just seems like it's kind of defeated. It's like,
actually, where does that come? Where do you get that impression?
I get that impression in all forms of Tibetan Buddhism, that I don't see it as strongly in other traditions. I love Tibetan Buddhism. I practice Tibetan Buddhism, but I don't mean to criticize unjustly. That's just my own impression, but I just wanted to say that because it can be so disheartening. It's like, okay, like I'll practice, but nothing's really major. No major transformation is going to take place. Like no true awakening is going to take place in me.
It's even in the story like about Milarepa, where he was like, if you guys aren't in a cave, you're not doing it right. Like, there's parts of it where, I know, but there's parts of it where, like, if you're really low and still trying to figure it out, that it does seem discouraging. Like, you know, if you don't go off and do this, that you're just not going to be able to get there at all. Like, you're just not doing it right.
I don't know. I don't view myself as being very low. Like in my, speaking from personal experience, every time I reach something and I look back and I see how much more I have to do, I just think, wow, I got here. I'm so grateful just to get here. So it's like, I mean, I can see how you can view it that way, but for me, it's like, I just have the recognition that it took this long to go that far, and if then I kind of actually get excited at the path and the process and the fact that, well, you know, I'm going to be in this for a while, so, you know, whatever's at the end has got to be huge.
I'll tell you where you'll find it. Dilgo Kensei, who I love, read all these
me
books.
too.
He says, at this stage in our development, we're not in any position to guide and help others. He actually makes it clear. I'll bring the book and I'll read the quote. We're not in a position, we're too degraded mentally because of our afflictions to be able to guide and help others, and that we must really devote ourselves to training our minds and finding and cultivating the kind of mindset where we're actually going to be able to benefit others instead of just thinking that we can guide and benefit others, but in the end, what we do is we end up harming others more than we end up benefiting them. That's what he says directly in his book, The Heart Treasures of the Enlightened Ones.
Well, I don't know. His holiness, and this is very simple. He says, you know, never give up. And also, he says that it's totally contrary to Buddhist teaching to doubt that any one of us can reach enlightenment because we can all do it. It doesn't matter how long it's going to take. So whatever we can do a little bit every day, I think that we do it according to what the level that we are at and aiming to go further and wherever we are. And I don't think that that's discouraging. It's, you know, it's a long haul, whatever it's going to take, but we can make a little progress every day with our own mind, even by, you know, deciding to live with more mindfulness, more awareness, whatever we can do every day. I don't think that, you know, of course I think the Dharmas are a great example, but in the end you want to look also at these people like Nirvana and so on. They started as, you know, like regular people actually. Some of these saints were killing people and all of that, and I think that's a great example, whatever we can do every day. And again, it's really contrary to the teaching to doubt that you can do that. It's like the lack of faith. So I think that, you know, that can help us to go forward. At whatever level we are, we do not want to diminish ourselves because we're low. Actually, we can see these great beings and say, okay, in this life, you know, I do as much as I can, and then I'll see where I'm going to go in the next one, and so on and so forth.
Rebecca had
I
some.
agree with that
Rebecca?
more or less, but
I just started to say that the lamas often say, if you have to stay with a lam rim your whole life, it's the path.
Right.
It's okay. And I've also heard some lamas, including Khenzo Rinpoche, say, with Americans, when they came to this country teaching the Dharma, that they feel as though we're saying, oh, the Lama will reach in his pocket and hand it to you. But we have to work hard to chip away. And the answers are all within the Lama and the stage is there. And Khenzo Rinpoche has often said, you know, if you have to stay there your whole life, deeply realize it. You know, just keep going with that. And it's the path. In other words, you know, I think when we say Tibetan Buddhism seems complicated, there are many teachings. It is vast. But all the lamas seem to go back to that. You know, if you read that every day, if you work with that every day, it's the path, the lamrim.
I don't disagree with any of that. I mean, this class isn't about what I think.
Yeah. But anyway, one more question, one more comment.
Yeah, I just saw in the Lotus Sutra, you know, all of us are future Buddhas, you know, whether you say agree with it or not, everybody is going to be at one time.
We have the potential.
No potential, you will become. it's not there, it's not there, I'm going to go away. You know, that's it so close that, you know, so there is a, yeah, just not recognizing it.
So can you wrap it, can you put all of these ideas together?
One last comment
Well,
on this.
one last comment is like you already have that nature within you. It's just whether, yeah, I mean, it's not, the path isn't linear. It's not like, oh, I finally achieved this, now I can go on to this. It like interweaves and is circular, and you already have all that stuff in you now.
And if
It's
your
about
mind
what
is
you can
not
do in this
calm,
lifetime, though. That's what.
That's the question, yeah.
Oh, Jody has.
I agree that a lot of it makes it sound like it's gonna be so hard, and, you know, they talk about countless eons and all that, but I don't think the intent is to discourage, it's to encourage us to practice now, and the same with the advice about going out to help. You can do a lot of damage thinking you're helping. I mean, it's always been my understanding that Buddhism is saying until you get yourself together, you're really not necessarily that big of a help. That doesn't mean if you see someone starving, you don't share your food. But you might not want to run off and, you know, start some big project that's very well-meaning on your part, but isn't actually solving. Plus, it's taking your time away from your practice, because it's another way of staying busy and putting off the practice because you're so busy with your helping. And that's how I always understood it, is the most important thing is our own personal practice. And when we reach the right point with that, the helping will come.
I'll make a few comments. I mean, one is, I mean, start with this. I mean, obviously the comment from His Holiness that, you know, if you can't help others, at least don't harm them. There's no doubt that that's true, right? In other words, that's the most basic truth, right? In other words, because, you know, if you're harming others, then there's nothing, you know, nothing good comes of that for you or others. So that's very clear. Then this issue of helping others, actually, one thing I remember a quote from Lama Yeshe, who said, actually, you know, he pointed out that at every level, you know, there's something actually you can do. You know, even, and so it doesn't contradict exactly what Dogen, you know, there is, like you were saying, there is like, you know, still if somebody bangs their foot, you know, you can put yourself there and say, okay, lean on me. You know, I mean, or at every level we're at, we can do something. There circumstances arise, you know, somebody's hungry, or, you know, or an animal's in need and you help them or something, you know, like, you know, that's different than, you know, obviously, and then but I guess the point there is this, and Lama Zopa points this out, at each level of the path, then your ability to help becomes hugely different, right? And the ability of a Buddha versus a 10th level Bodhisattva is usually different. That's usually different than, you know, an 8th level Bodhisattva, which is different than, and so on, all the way down to an ordinary person, that the more you learn, then the more you can help, right? Whereas if you've studied a little bit more, then you can give somebody some advice a little bit, but if you haven't, then you can't, you know, and so on. So there is, you know, you have to be realistic of our level, and if we, so that there's a truth to that. There is that if you know, if you pretend you're at a level you're not at, you know, then that's no good either, right? That's totally useless. One other thing too, just like using the example of Milarepa, like, you know, Milarepa points out, right, that Marpa didn't have to do what he did, right? Like Marpa achieved Buddhahood while being a family man.
The householder?
He was a householder, yeah. He had a son, a wife, a big house, a farm, you know, like a bunch of students. Like he had a big, you know, whole big shebang, and he was traveling to India and back and all that. And you know, and what Milarepa actually, you know, somebody said to, actually I think it was Milarepa's sister said, you know, what are you doing in this cave? You're naked. You know, she was like freaking out. You know, Milarepa, you know, why are you acting like this? And you know, like, because it didn't look good. You know, and you know, and Milarepa, and she said Marpa did that. You know, he was your teacher. I think it was her. It may have been somebody else. She said, you know, look at Marpa. He has a big house and a wife and you know, like nice stuff, and you know, and you know, and I like this quote from Milarepa, because what Milarepa said was he said I can't remember the exact words, but you know, basically he said, if you know, something like this, something like, well, if a jackal pretends it's a lion, then the jackal's going to have a problem. You know, like, in other words, so Milarepa knew his own level, right? And he knew, I can't, you know, Marpa was capable of becoming a Buddha while maintaining a householder's life. Milarepa looked at himself and said, I'm not capable of that. I have to go in strict retreat and I'll become enlightened and so on. You know, and so there's something quite beautiful about Milarepa's self-honesty there, you know. And yet Milarepa is the first, he's famed as being the first Tibetan who achieved enlightenment in one lifetime. Which doesn't mean he was the first Tibetan to achieve enlightenment, actually, right? there were others, like at the time of Padmasambhava and so on, who achieved, but they had already achieved certain levels of the path, and then they finished the path. He was the first person to go from being a ordinary person who committed murder to a Buddha in one life. That's quite a remarkable achievement, right? Other people had achieved enlightenment, but they were already quite advanced, and they just finished the job, so to speak. But so I just want to mention that quote of Milarepa's, because I think it's important that, like, what Milarepa there, I think, was getting at was that, like, everybody's different, right? And, like, he wasn't saying all my, then, like, his student, right, again, Popa was a monk, right, who sort of had, Milarepa was sort of like a, not a monk, right, he would wear robes, he wore nothing, he was, like, naked yogi living in a cave, sometimes had just a white cloth, and then, his student, again, Popa was a monk and a scholar and so on. Milarepa wasn't a scholar. I think Milarepa made a very profound point there, that, like, everybody has to, whereas the path, the elements of the path are the same, right? Because everybody has to realize bodhicitta, or you don't become a Buddha, right? Everybody has to gain calm abiding. Everybody has to realize emptiness. There's no way you become enlightened if you don't realize emptiness. But then for individual human beings, of course, well, we're all different, So, and like, so I think it's quite, what's the way to say it? Like, well, and then I'll just say one other thing, like, actually, just in terms of your thought, was that, Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa Rinpoche, like Lama Zopa Rinpoche for sure, and Lama Yeshe was the same, but Lama Zopa Rinpoche really said, he's very clear that, his view is that Westerners should be gaining realization. There is no, he's very clear about that. There is, like, the job, there is the like, that should happen, it does happen. So there's no, he's very clear that there's no, like, only Tibetans do that, or only, and Lama Zopa often emphasizes ordinary people. There is among Tibetans, there are many ordinary people who became enlightened, so, and in modern times, so he often tells stories. If you meet Lama Zopa Rinpoche, recently if he tells those, but for many years he's always told stories about people he knew who were ordinary people who became enlightened, and not all of them were great scholars. Some were great scholars, like Geshes who went off on retreat, but he tells stories of other people who were just ordinary people who, went and, like, heard teachings from Babonka Rinpoche, or heard teachings from Trijang Rinpoche, or heard teaching, went off into retreats and became enlightened. So I would say it's like, at least Lama Zopa's stance is that that's quite possible. It's up to the individual. But I guess my point there is that it's really up to the individual person, so, and that we all have, like, freedom, and that the idea is that Buddhism is just presenting options, right, of like, stages of paths, methods, and then it's up to us individually to do two things. One is to decide what's our own goal, right? Because like, although it's clearly emphasized in Tibetan Buddhism, the idea of bodhicitta is a very good idea, and the idea of becoming enlightened quickly is good because it benefits others more. But then it's up to the individual, right? So, like, one person can reasonably say, I want to aim at this for now, and then other people can say, and I guess I think that's quite important to what Milarepa said also. It's like, so you have to do two things. One is know what's your goal, but also then see at any given time what's your capacity. But you don't know what your capacity will be, like you said, down the road. And there are many stories like that, actually. There's a Kadampa Lama, I forget which one, from the old, like, Atisha's time, a little after Atisha, who said, he said, if you create because actually this is what the 12 links of dependent origination are about, are cause and effect, right? And what he said was that, he said, if you create the right causes, if you create the causes for suffering, then you can't imagine how much suffering you can have, right? But if you create the right causes for realizations and for enlightenment, then also you can't, like, in other words, people can achieve things they never thought they could achieve. And both are true. In other words, it can go one way or it can go the other. But it's mainly, so then what it comes down to is, in the moment, practicing as best you can, in this moment, because we don't know, actually. And also, like, is we don't really know what other karmas we have from past lives, according to the 12 links of dependent origination, right? But what we can do is practice our best each day, right? And then, actually, we don't know where we'll be at, right? Like, in other words, it's possible that, what's the way to say it? It's possible that you'll achieve things you never thought you would, and it's also possible you won't, right? And actually, I'll share one other story. I always like this story. People know the story of Varupa. Varupa was one of the 84 Mahasiddhas of India. I just like this story, so I'm just going to share it. But he was like, I guess he was like a scholar, monk, like a teacher, like a monk who was teaching. And so all day he would, like, he was a scholar at the monastery, so all day he would teach Buddhism, And then at night he would hide out in his room and do tantric practices all night. So he would stay up, like Lama Zopa, I guess, all night he would stay up doing tantric practice. And he did that for many, many, many years. And I think he was practicing Chakra Samvara. And they say after many years, he thought after many years of doing that, and he didn't sleep, or very little sleep, it was like incredibly hard. Then one day he looked around and he thought, like, I don't know, I forget how many years it was, for this many years, I'm staying up all night doing these tantric practices, and I'm very and in the day I teach, and at night I do that, and it's like so difficult. And he said, I haven't gained any realizations at all.
Really?
And he got very upset, and he took his rosary, and in India, it's not a toilet like here, if you go into India, it's a hole in the ground, right? Just a hole, and then there's poop, and pee. And he said, forget it, and he threw his rosary in his mala in that, what's it called? Poop, and he thought, I give up on this, I can't do it, I can't do that. I don't have any karma for tantric success in tantric practice. Which is funny, right? First of all, here he's like, he's already like a great scholar, and all, he actually threw in the, and then, and they say then, at that moment he had a vision of a goddess whose name means selflessness, Nirvana. And she appeared to him and she said, your karma is with me, not with Chakra Samvara, or something, you're doing the wrong practice. And she said, let me give you the initiation right now of the correct practice for you to do. And then, he took that, and they say that then by dawn he had achieved the 8th Bodhisattva Bhumi, and then they say that he wandered out from the monastery and started wandering around India, singing songs of enlightenment and all that. And he was like an enlightened being at that point, right? And they tell a story that he went to some bar or something. He had all kinds of wild stories. He became this really unconventional Mahasiddha, and most of the Sakya lineage teachings come from Virupa, right? And the lineage of Hevadra in Tibet comes mainly from Virupa. So anyway, my point there is we don't know. Virupa at that point, he was a great scholar. He was a monk. He had practiced for decades, and he thought that one night he thought, I have no karma for any. And the next day he was enlightened. So my point is if he didn't know, then we don't know either. Actually. So we have to just do. But I think he was a good model because what he did was he practiced really hard for all those years. That didn't happen because he had been watching, whatever, watching shows and napping a lot, right? In other words, he thought he had no karma to have any realizations, but actually he had been practicing very hard for all those decades or whatever. So I think the point is that we don't know what the result will be, and we shouldn't worry too much actually. In other words, if we create the right causes, then we can have faith. You were saying about faith. I think that's the right. In other words, the one faith we can have is if you create the right causes, then the right results will come. And so whatever level you're at, whether you're aiming at whatever you're aiming at, just to not hurt other people, or you're aiming to benefit others or whatever, if you create the right causes, then you can have faith that the right results will come. And I think sometimes if we worry too much about when, that actually becomes an obstacle. Also, remember the story we've told it before, but of Asanga, right? Asanga was one of the greatest Buddhist saints of all time, right? And and he had those things where after 3 years he had no realization, and then he saw somebody, what was it? The bird was touching the side of the mountain, and there was a groove, right? And bird feathers had worn out. And I guess that's the point in a way, right? With Buddhism is that if you create the right causes, the right results will come, right? And even a tiniest cause, right? Like a bird's feather. You've been to the Grand Canyon, right? It's not that big a river, right? But look at the size of the canyon. The point there is that if you create the right causes, big results will eventually happen, because karma expands. So, right, one of the 4 guidelines of karma is that karma expands. So our job actually in daily life is to create the right causes. And whatever our goal is, you have to create causes to achieve it, and not to worry too much, because we don't really know. Actually, we could die tomorrow, we could live to 90, right? Or whatever. And also we could and we don't know what the result. We don't know when the results will come. But if you understand karma, the results will come.
Just a quick point on that subject. What I read was that if you want to have the right focus, you shouldn't actually worry about have any preoccupation about your progress this life. That everything that you're doing is preparing for future lives. Is that the same thing that we're discussing now, or something different?
What that's really saying is this. That's getting at the entryway to Dharma, right? Is they call it giving up on the affairs of this life.
Is that the worldly concerns?
Yeah, the worldly concerns and things like. So what that's really getting at is this: whereas if you've realized, actually, in a way, it's this: if you've realized impermanence, right? Actually, if you just realize that simple point about impermanence, whereas then you can't worry too much about these things, because if I sit around going, well, I'm carrying these causes and will I achieve it? And this, well, actually, I may die tonight. You know, so like, whereas if I'm, you know, it's like, so actually it's a little bit funny. If I'm worrying too much, well, what's going to happen, you know, at that point down the road? Well, that means I haven't realized the very first, you know, one of the very earliest trainings is realizing impermanence, right? And if you realize impermanence, in a way, then, like, you know, then you have this thought of like, the thought of a person who's like, you know, when you've checked into a hotel, like you don't worry about how's the room going to be next year, right? In other words, because you're leaving tomorrow. In other words, like it's like that. Like in other words, that you have that kind of feeling, like, well, I'm leaving any day, so it's no big deal. You know, like in other words, like you know, like in your house, if there's some small problem, then you're like worried about it, right? Oh, the water, like oh, there's a drip there or something, right? It's like oh, this is a problem. Whereas if it's a hotel room, who cares? Like I'm leaving in the morning, I don't care if it's a drip or not a drip. You know, it's like as long as it's not keeping me up, I don't really, you know, it's not my problem. You know, or something of that sort. So it's like that. It's like having the mind of a person who's leaving tomorrow. Or is it that if you have that kind of mind, then all those things are not so important. You know, and even the idea of like when will I achieve this, when will I achieve that, but also even worldly things like you know what do people think of me, or what's my reputation, or you know does this person like me or not like me. You know, if you have the mind, it's like that. You know, like if you're in a hotel and like if you check into a hotel and as you're going into your room, you know, the guy in the next room looks at you funny, right? Like, well, who cares? Like, in the morning, he's not going to even see me as I'm leaving, most likely, and I'm never going to see him again. So it doesn't matter if he looked at me funny, you know. Whereas we tend to like worry a lot, you know, in our daily life. If our neighbor does that or our coworker looks at us funny, then we start to think, oh no, you know, why did they look at me? The idea is to have the mind of a person who's leaving tomorrow, and then it's like.
I think the issue with Milarepa that I think you pointed to both I think what the solution is, but what actually the problem is. Milarepa knew that he wasn't a lion. He knew he was a jackal. Just to use the analogy that you gave. We don't know, and so see, Milarepa knew where he was, and I just want to just make it like a.
I disagree though. In other words, he knew that he is not. That's not secret karma. That's not. There's when Milarepa said, "I'm a jackal. I'm not a lion." He wasn't getting at something like hidden phenomenon, like what's. Whereas there's another thing like what Rupa didn't know, right? Like he didn't know that he was going to achieve enlightenment that night. Obviously, or he would throw his thing. But that's a hidden phenomenon, right? A very hidden phenomenon. I'm not talking with Milarepa. I think his comment about "I'm a jackal, not a lion" was very concrete. In other words, what he was getting at was Marpa can be in the midst of phenomena,
worldly concerns,
and yet have no attachment, and yet have that mind that transforms everything into Dharma. Whereas Milarepa knew, because that's not hard to, that's not a hidden phenomenon. Whereas Milarepa saw, if I go around people, my mind starts getting all freaked out. And so that's not a hidden phenomenon. In other words, that's something that we can know about ourselves. You know, that's an obvious thing. In other words, you can go and check yourself. You can say, well, if I'm around these things, can I practice, or do I get totally caught up? And what Milarepa saw was, if I'm around people, you know, I'm whatever, you know, they're trying to kill me, and I'm getting mad at them, and then I have to get scared of them, and I'm running away. Whereas he was having all kinds of drama in his life. So this was not a hidden phenomenon. Whereas he saw that he wasn't like that Marpa had this ability to be around things and yet transform it. And Milarepa saw, when I'm around stuff, I can't transform it. It becomes a problem. It becomes drama. It becomes issues for me. And so I have to get away from that because I'm not capable. Like he saw, and the analogy is that, is like a lion can go in the middle of a whole bunch of, what's the way to say it? Like if a lion is surrounded by other animals, it's fearless, right? Because nothing attacks a lion. Whereas like other animals have to be on guard all the time, right? I think that's part of the analogy, is like Marpa was like a lion in the sense that he could be at ease wherever he went because he had some ability to transform everything into Dharma. Like King Indrabhuti was like, there are certain practitioners who are like that, where they can be in very busy circumstances, but they're lion-like in the sense that they can sort of be at ease and transform everything. And you can see some lamas who are like that. In other words, they can be in the midst of the most busy circumstances, and yet they're totally at ease. And there is and maybe some of us are like that. I don't know. You know, but then there are other kinds of practitioners where they get around circumstances, and it's like, you know, like you're always getting caught up in it. You know what I mean? Like, you know, this person thought that, and you start to feel something, and even if you don't want to, you feel it. You know, and then so then you know for yourself. That's all. I just want to comment on that. That's I think what the right
That clarifies it. Thank you.
Yeah. I guess we're past the time actually, so we'll do the Dependent Origination next time. At least we cover the first 3 links, right? So you guys remember those? Ignorance, karma, and consciousness. And I'll make one last comment. So the consciousness also, there's causal consciousness and there's resultant consciousness. So the causal consciousness is the imprint. Later that's going to ripen in a resultant consciousness, which will have an experience. Does that make sense? At least that makes sense, right? So those are the first 3 links, because we're going to pick up there next time. So ignorance, karmic formations, or the causal karma, and then the causal karmic imprint is placed on conscious. So at least you remember that, and then we'll get to it next time. But let's dedicate in the merit, okay? Precious supreme bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness. All powerful Chenrezig, Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until Samsara is end. Well, let's just dedicate right through these merits. May each of us here, be able to gain some kind of understanding, practice the path, overcome our afflictive emotions, increase our positive states of love, compassion, wisdom. We progress along the path, and then she become fully enlightened, or be of benefit to all mother sentient beings.